I
Hi
can
there.
hear you.
Hello.
Hello, Chris. I can hear you.
Okay. Well, I've got loads of background music.
Okay. I think Chris talk is going well.
Oh, okay. Can you actually see me?
Yes, very clearly. Thank you.
Oh, right. There it goes. Sorry, I was looking at a picture of Alan Hopkirk's room. Alan says to say hello, by the way.
Well, there you go. Thank you.
She gone. Oh, good evening, Chris.
Right, Chris, you'll just tell us when we're ready to roll, and then we will roll.
Well, I'm ready.
But
Whatever.
Chris's lips are moving. My lip reading skills are somewhat lacking.
Okay. Can you actually hear me though?
I can hear you clearly. Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Everything's fine from our side.
All right. Now,
Yeah,
Chris
Chris.
Clark needs to get himself
Here I am.
unmuted. Oh, you are?
Yeah, I pressed the little button on my microphone which says on.
Oh, yeah, that helps.
I see
Fantastic.
we've got a Galaxy and we've got a Redmi. I was asking them
Yeah.
their real names.
Well, I gather that the UAE is about to start orbiting Mars, so maybe it's one of those chatting to us from the red planet, as they say. Who knows?
You know, eh?
Stefan?
Wise
Okay.
got muted. Oh, there's back again.
Yeah, it said the host muted me anyway.
Oh, well, now you're unmuted. I can hear you again. Look, might as
Okay.
well start. They'll rush in last minute, of course. So they'll do it at church. So, Anthony, raise your glass.
All right. Can we get going?
Yeah, why not?
Right. Excuse me. Well, it's Wednesday evening. It's 7:30, and so that means another in the series, Talking Hi-Fi, brought to you by the Cape Town Hi-Fi Club. Good evening, and welcome to those who managed to overcome load shedding to join us. Our guest tonight is something of a legend in local audio circles. Joining us from his home in the Far East Rand that is Chris Templer. Chris's audio philosophy, honed over half a century, blends the disarmingly simple and low-powered with the fiendishly complex and high-powered in his quest for the ultimate connection with the music, suggesting that there is no one solution. However, one gets the feeling that he's partial to the view that there's no substitute for cubic inches. By his own admission, did not own a speaker smaller than a 12-incher before moving up to cabinets containing twin 15 inches, supplemented by a quartet of 18 inches in his subwoofer tube. This same person, as a sometime musician, graduated from playing the tuba in a brass band to having a pipe organ installed in his music room. I think you can see a pattern emerging here. But let's have the man tell it in his own words. Chris, why don't you start by giving us an idea of what formed your early life and how you embarked on your audio journey? Over to you.
Okay, it started when I was probably about 12 or 13. The family had an old Ferguson radio, and this thing had inputs for phono, and you could plug extra speakers in it, and I used to mess around with that. And it sort of grew from there. My first standalone amplifier was a Geloso, which was mono with 80 watts valve thing. And I blew the cone completely out of a Philips speaker with that. And it just sort of snowballed from there. I started with Goodman's Axioms, which I bought new. In those days, early 60s, an Axiom 201 was 25 Rand brand new. And I got a pair of those, and then I built cabinets for them, and I spent years going from one cabinet design to another cabinet design. Amplifiers, I had at one point. You've gone.
Yeah, we're still there.
Okay. I have no picture anyway.
No, we can see you clear.
Okay, now you're back. I ended up at one point with a Leek amplifier and Thornton's TD124 turntable, 124, something like that, which I got from one of the wealthy shop owners in Springs who was upgrading. Don't quite know how you upgrade from a Leek Stereo 20, but anyway. And it just went on and on. I put the Goodmans into 2.2 meter long concrete pipes with all the required rubbish inside them. A metal cone suspended above them to diffuse the sound, and on top of that, a platform with other speakers, a mid-range and treble unit. I'd like to say that I had an understanding wife. To be quite candid, she didn't notice things like that, you know. Her life was all round horses, and I always used to say, she walked into the sitting room and her chair was gone. She'd only notice when she wanted to sit on it. But anyway, over the years, I've sort of did my radio amateur license, and I plowed on and on and on with audio. I sold the Leek because place where I was working for De Beers Industrial Diamonds at that point, the electronics manager had just discovered transistors, and he decided to build 3 transistorized amplifiers, 60 watts per channel they were, and he insisted on putting fuses in the output in case I blew the Goodmans. In actual fact, his amplifiers blew up before the Goodmans. Then I bought another Leek. I bought it at some point a Pioneer SM83. It's just too much to imagine. Then, many years later, I met up with a chappie called Digby Elworthy, who was doing all of the repairs on speakers for the SABC and Tannoy repairs for ProSound, who were the agents at that point. And he convinced me to start buying Tannoys. And he would say, right, this pair is coming up, you buy those, you don't touch those. I ended up with 10 pairs of Tannoy 15-inch speakers, including a set of Monitor Reds. So I looked around for cabinets to build, and I figured out that what I really needed were the autograph cabinets, which were rear-loaded horns. Got plans for them eventually, and had them built by this chappie up the road that does all my woodwork. That's when I actually met him. I built a pair for Alan Hopkirk, and I built another pair that went to Wales. So
about when, Chris, I'm just going to interject this. So about when would that be in sort of the trajectory of your journey?
You asked me 2001.
Okay, and in the meantime, so what have you been doing with your life? I mean, what sort of pursuits did you have outside of audio?
Work-wise or hobby-wise?
Yeah, well, just work-wise, I think people are usually interested to see what informs one's choices when it comes to audio. So maybe work-wise be interesting.
Okay, I started off doing a Chemtech diploma. I worked for SAPI in Springs in the lab, which I hated. Thought I'd love chemistry. Uncle of mine persuaded me to go into Barclays Bank. I worked there for a couple of years. I did my banking exams for a few years.
Well, they survived.
Yeah, they survived. Then I went to work for De Beers Industrial Diamonds in Springs. They were called ultra-high pressure units, actually manufacturing industrial diamonds. And after a couple of years there, I was transferred to the Diamond Research Lab, which was in Crown Mines. And I was really happy doing research. Then I got married. Then I needed to earn a serious salary. So, because when I got married, my wife had 3 kids and umpteen horses. So I decided to try my hand at selling. And I sold various things, and so I finally settled, believe it or not, on radiators.
Mm-hmm.
you know, for cars and trucks and earth-moving equipment. And I worked for a couple of radiator shops till eventually I opened my own shop in partnership with a chap, and then that worked out very, very well. And then we both sold our shares in the radiator shop to somebody else, and he went off to run the BMW agents in Springs, and I went through to work for a company called National Radiators, running their warehouse. They were manufacturers. I ended up running the warehouse, the factory, the admin, and then I got handed the blooming computer network as well, which was based in Durban, at the main plant in Durban. After about 10 years in that, I got together with another chap, and we actually opened a radiator manufacturing plant in Johannesburg, which also worked very, very well, but partners are sometimes a very dicky thing to have. And eventually, after 10 years, I pretty much forced him to buy me out. And my son and I bought I bought, and my son came with me, a small printing business in Linden, which we grew and grew and grew. We moved to Benrose 5 or 6 years ago, and we've got a big 7-color Heidelberg press and all sorts of Xerox machines. And then I decided to retire. I said to my son, right, okay, that's my pension. So you run the business and just pay me. And so basically that's when I retired, which is, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago.
So that pretty much brings us up to the current day, and I think we've covered quite a bit of your audio journey, which we will return to in bits and pieces. I think from what you've told us, one can get an idea of what it is you're looking for when listening to recorded music. But maybe you want to tell us, what is it that you're actually searching for? What are those characteristics, those attributes that you prize in recorded music?
Okay. First of all, everybody's got their own opinion. Nobody's opinion is really right or wrong. It's what you actually want. And it's very, very easy to be an idiot, as I have proved to myself over and over. You mentioned just now my subwoofer having two 18-inch speakers. That's actually not correct. My subwoofer has 4 18-inch speakers. And a quick description, if you imagine a wooden tube that is 600 millimeters on a side and 6 meters long, with 4 18-inch drivers on one end and a roller Dacron shoved up the other end, that's my subwoofer. You know, you've got to be quite mad. When I was playing with the Tannoys along the line, because I love organ music, I started to build a pipe organ with a friend of mine. And we'd built a couple of ranks of pipe and a console, and we'd revamped a harmonium, which was going to form the reed section. And then, when I say a friend of mine, a very, very good friend of mine, he only ever did me one disservice in his life, and that was introducing me to my wife. She agreed with that one. But he unfortunately got cancer and he died. And sort of the spirit to work on a big project like that, it was not really there, just one person. You know, you can't manipulate enormous pieces of wood, and you don't really want to by yourself. Well, I didn't want to by myself. So I palmed all the things we built off into another friend of mine who had a pipe organ. And I approached an organ builder in Pretoria called Jan Zielman, and I bought the organ that came out of the Dutch Reformed Church in Dorison Street. Again, never do things by half. If it's worth doing, it's worth overdoing. Normally a church has an organ of about 900 to 1100 pipes. The Dorison Street Church used to be what they called their Spochkerk, and that organ had 2,300 pipes. You know, it was double the size of a normal church organ. I had to build onto the building that I had my hi-fi stuff in, and we crammed this organ into it, and then I added more, a couple of ranks
Chris,
of
I'm going to
five.
interrupt there just for a question. Now, what I'd like to know is, how did you sneak this organ into the house?
Sorry, I'm getting things. No, Dad, I have an outside room. And the room is essentially 15 meters by 8 meters inside.
Wow.
And if people will please stop sending me WhatsApp messages. Anyway, and my wife has never had any problem with what I do, my hobbies, whatever, because, as I say, she was very focused on her horses. And you cannot believe when I say focused on her horses, that was basically her life, that and teaching. Anyway, got the organ in, got it working, and I had enormous fun working on the organ. I meant early on, you mentioned I played a tuba, B-flat tuba in a brass band, which I didn't play badly, but I wasn't by no means professional standard. And the organ, I got to the point where I could play simple music and sight read music, but I then realized that I would never play the sort of music I want to listen to. And B, I was too lazy to practice, having just started up the printing business at the other side of Johannesburg, for where I'm staying. It's a case of leave home at 5:30 in the morning and get back 6:30, 7 o'clock at night. And also, quite candidly, I don't think I had the talent to play it. So I ended up selling the organ and partitioning the place off, and that's where my subwoofer lies. I'm currently storing a 2.8 Wurlitzer ex-Estate Theatre, which is an old theatre organ. Anyway, right.
The question was, what is it that you're looking for in a reproduction system when you're listening to recorded music?
I'm not actually listening to the system if I can possibly avoid it. What I want to do is try and listen to the instruments. I was exposed a lot in my early years to amateur theatre, where I started playing with recordings, and we had an orchestra, or there was an orchestra, a 15-piece orchestra. And then in the brass band, I got used to what instruments should sound like. This friend of mine that I was building the organ with, he played all of the keyboard instruments, all of the wind instruments. And he basically taught me to play the tuba. And he was one of those people that when he was conducting a band, he would suddenly stop everybody and say, listen, that trumpet, just pull the slide out a little bit. You know, he had an incredible ear for music, and he basically passed it on. And my ear for music comes from him. And as far as listening to music, I want to try and get something as realistic as possible. I get all tied up and neurotic when I listen to, for example, recordings, reference recordings, Professor Keith Johnson. Those recordings to me are probably the worst that they ever made. Some people love them to death, but nothing is real. Some of the very old recordings of Leonard Bernstein, CBS, I think it was, and the early Mercury recordings, they can be very, very good. Through the sort of 80s and 90s, and I think 2000s, recording quality seemed to drop down, and today only is it coming back. I've recently acquired a very, very nice tape deck, the Atari MTR-10, and playing some of my tapes from years ago, it makes you realize that we lose a hell of a lot in the reproduction via digitally. And let me not even start on records, because I had at one point about 3,500 records, of which maybe 100 were what I would consider something worth listening to. So yeah, okay, sorry. As I said before, my opinion, and I know I'm kooky.
And what are the elements in that the reproduction chain that you think can get in the way of getting closer to the music? What are the parts that you think the elements that help you get closer? In fact, what parts of your setup help you get closer to what the intention of the performer or the composer is? What do you think?
Okay. First of all, to me, probably the most important part. Oh, here video's gone again. The most important part to me is the speaker. Am I still online?
Yes, we can see you. We can hear you.
You back again. You keep dropping out. Anyway, not that anything can be the most important, but a loudspeaker system is very important because it's the thing that has to transfer all the electronic gubbins into sound. I have 3 amplifiers. I've got a Leek Stereo 20. This is number 3, I think. I have a pair of 300B parallel 300B monoblocks that Alan built for me years ago, and my pride and joy, which is a TAC Lingdorf amplifier, and only the TAC is actually accurate. The others all color the sound. I was at Alan today, and he's got, at the moment, I think 12 different amplifiers in his room, and each one sounds different, and that, to me, is actually a fault. The amplifier you shouldn't be able to hear. Well, again, my opinion, I drive it through a Cambridge 851 streamer, and it goes through a switch box that Dewald Visser made for me, and that's it.
So, as I said in my introduction, it is a bit of a combination of the simple and the complex, and the less powerful and the extremely powerful.
Yeah, look, if you talk power, the Leek is 10 watts, the Triads are 15. The TACT is supposed to develop 200 into 8 ohms. And the TACT is a strange amplifier. It has a display, a volume display that reads from 0 to 100. Who knows what the steps are, but it needs to play somewhere from 65 up. I had a pair of SoundLab electrostats at one point. In fact, the only speaker that I've ever, commercially made speaker, complete unit that I've ever owned. And the TACT had to run it up to 95 to get them to sound, give me a bit of volume. And the only thing with the TACT then, above 95, you started to lose dynamics. It's class D, but not the way that Gain Clone and the rest of them do it. And I was told by John Topham that above 95 on the display, I would start to lose dynamics, and that was all. You cannot cause the amplifier to distort. So as far as power, yeah, okay. But all my speakers are above 100 dB sensitive.
So clearly that is a direction that you've decided to head into then, am I correct?
Yeah. I essentially started with Goodman's, and the Axiom 201s are around about 97 dB. And I ended up with them in rear-loaded horn cabinets, a thing called a Decker horn designed by a man called Ralph West. And that's when I met Alan Hopkirk. And actually, it's quite funny because the Decker cabinets, they had a mouth in inches, 18 inches by 18 inches, the horn out, I think 450, somewhere around there. And they were designed to face into the corner, including the driver. The driver was tilted back at 15 degrees, and the idea was that the corner became part of the horn, because how deep you go, it depends upon your horn mouth. And I had a pair of metal horns with drivers on them for mid-range and treble, and they used to hang from little thin chains from the ceiling. And when I met Alan Hopkirk, he came and he listened to it, and Alan, being Alan, never says anything wrong about anybody. He said, they're certainly lively. Yeah. So, but again, sensitivity is my thing.
Is that partly a function of what you prefer to listen to, or does that not come into it? Or what type of music?
I have this. Look, I basically only listen to classical music. I have some jazz to infect other people with when they come and visit, but not really my thing. I have this little suspicion inside me that says to me, when your speaker is sensitive, you don't have to have big movements of your cone. You don't have to put loads of power in it to get it to start moving, get it to stop moving and go in the other direction. And that's basically how my mind works. I'm not sure if I'm right, but yeah, that's what I think, and I'm happy with that. I can literally, and I'm not talking about a sound pressure meter on my cell phone, on a proper professional sound meter, I can sustain 110 dB at 6 meters different distance from our speakers. And that is an enormous sound pressure because I think you probably lose about 8 or 9 dB in that 6 meters. And I'm doing that, I can do that with 10 watts.
Okay, just before I head on to my next question, which will be related to that, I'd like to remind those who are viewing this session that I'm happy to relay your questions to Chris if you want to put them up on the chat on the side of the screen. Alternatively, of course, once we're done with the actual audiovisual part of this, I'm sure Chris will be happy to field a few questions at the end of proceedings in about half an hour's time. At any rate, Chris, just to move back to those speaker designs and the high efficiency route that you've gone on, tell us a bit about those, where your design path has led you. Have there been some blind alleys, some dead ends, or have you managed to keep going in a direction?
Yeah, I went down a 15-year blind alley with Tannoy. And I mean, I built, oh, goodness knows how many cabinets. Sorry, I didn't need to cough my lung out. It's not COVID, that's pure cigarettes. I built 3 sets of autographs, 2 sets of the JRF rectangular cabinets, a couple of smaller cabinets for somebody else, and then a double autograph, which took 2 15-inch monitor girls per side, vertically stacked, which was a development from the autograph. I sort of scaled it up. And very, very early in my speaker building career, I figured out that thin sidewalls are not what you want in a speaker cabinet. You want them solid and you want them braced. So the autograph sidewalls were all 32 millimeter thick. The cabinets weighed 285 kilograms each, which is an enormous amount. Then from Andre, I forget his surname, BJ, I think on the forum, I bought a set of Altec A7 clones with Fostex drivers. I connected them up and I couldn't get rid of the tannoys more quickly. I commissioned my woodworking chappie to build me a set of A7 cabinets, but to my spec, which is 32 millimeter thick walls. The horns have got to be 32 mil thick, and covered with a wood finish, or with veneered finish rather than painted black. And about that time, another chappie in Joburg, Mark Andrews, winders on the forum, I bought a pair of 15-inch Goodman Audiums from him for a ridiculous price. New in their box, 200 Rand. So what else do you do but you take your original A7 cabinets and you have them clad and make them 32 millimeter thick. That's how I ended up with 2 of them stacked. I didn't like the metal horn from the Fostex, so Rob made me up a set of multi-cells, but I reduced the size of them, not because there wasn't room for them, but I wanted to reduce the efficiency so I didn't have to damp them down. I wanted to run the drivers pretty much full open. Well, you know, without having an L pad or something like that in the way. And then I sat back and enjoyed it. But I still enjoy playing with speakers. So, you know, things come along and you try it. Those Onken cabinets that Alan Hopkirk has got, that was on the picture that while I was waiting to think, I got a pair of Altec 604 duplex speakers, and I built, when I say I built, I mean my woodworking chappie. I had him build up a set of Onken cabinets, also with 32mm walls and whatever. Put those speakers in. And when we finally got the things right, so they sounded like something, Alan fell in love with them, so they ended up at his place. And then it sort of snowballs. I go from one to the other to the other. You showed a picture of a cabinet which has two 12-inch drivers in it, and on top of it you've got those so-called bum cheek horns. Those drivers were 12-inch Goodmans. And I built that up, and I was persuaded to sell that to somebody. And that financed my next project, which was the current thing that I've just finished, which is an extended Onken cabinet with double 12-inch drivers and two mid-range horns with lenses on them and a tweet. Oh God, sorry. It just goes on and on.
What is it about those the vintage drivers and those vintage designs that even in 2021, you know, this is the era of digital signal processing. What still makes them of interest?
Timbre, the tone. I've yet to hear a modern speaker that is tonally, well, to my ears, tonally correct. And most speakers that I've heard suffer very badly in the upper bass, lower mid-range. They just don't, that sound doesn't come up. And it's very easy to make a speaker bright. It's very difficult to get a lot of treble without it sounding bright. I don't know if that makes sense to you. If I take this Wurlitzer that I've got in storage, if I take one of the elements from the xylophone off little metal bar and I hang it from a piece of string and I hit it with a metal bar, it rings. I can reproduce that. Most speakers just can't get that actual sharp impact with lots and lots of detail and treble without it getting harsh. Right, harsh, you know, whatever you want to call it. My big speakers, I've got two JBL 075s, which are bullet, they call them bullet tweeters, I think. They also about 106 or 108 dB sensitive each. I've got two of them in parallel, which will up the sensitivity by 3 dB. And the only actual true crossover element is I've got a horn with a Celestion driver on it that comes in at 14 kilohertz and goes up from there to way past what we can hear. Well, I say I can hear. I mean, my hearing tops out at about, I don't know, 13, 14 kilohertz now. But if you don't have those frequencies, you don't get harmonic down mixing. And then I've got a pair of super tweeters on top of that, which, again, the super tweeters start at 20 kilohertz and go up from there. But when you put them in while you're playing music and you connect them up, you can hear a change in the sound because you get harmonic down mixing as well as harmonic up mixing, and you don't have it, your harmonic structure of the music is not right.
Now, Chris, you mentioned crossovers, and I was actually going to ask you about that. Do these beasts, by their very nature, they not have fairly simple and not particularly complex crossovers?
Well, mine are extremely simple. On my latest speakers, which everybody, including Alan, who's heard them, Alan's comment was, you can't do better than this. It has a very complex crossover. There's one capacitor on the mid-range. There's one capacitor on the tweeter, and the main drivers are run full range. That's it.
Are you a believer in very, shall we say, boutique components for those?
Okay. I hope Joshua isn't listening because he's going to kill me for this. Yeah. My big system on my prize JBL 075 drivers, I have cheap, when I say cheap here, I have a handful because they were rescued from computer motherboards, tiny little blue things. And anyway, I used them, and Joshua talked me into getting some Ordine capacitors, copper capacitors. Huge, huge things. I mean, the size of a D-cell battery. Anyway, I got them from him, I put them on, and I listened to them. I thought to myself, it's funny, I'm not really hearing any difference. And of course, when you're buggering around, you use alligator clips so you can, swap them over quickly. And I thought, yeah, maybe they're a little bit, tiny little bit, 1 dB, 2 dB, maybe louder. Alan came round, he listened, he agreed with me. There's maybe a slight volume change. Deerwald came and he listened. Another friend of mine, George Gasser, came, same thing. But what I was finding is that when I have loads of treble in, for example, if I play a theatre pipe organ recording that has chimes and bells and things in it, I was getting almost right at the top a little doubling of the treble. It was almost like a little echo. Swap back to my cheapy capacitors, gone. Go back to these fancy Ordines, and that distortion was back. So they went.
Well, I guess in just the quests continued, but it's horses for courses, really.
Yeah, it's all subjective. It's what you like and what you want to do.
Moving a little bit further up the reproduction chain, you do have a mix of valve and, I think, if I'm not mistaken, and solid state. Do you have any particular views on what they can or can't do for you? I recall that you mentioned a room full of amps and with some of them.
Okay. I don't think Alan will get cross with me when I say what I'm about to say. He's currently got at least 12 amplifiers. And with the exception of the Leek, they've all been built by him. They all sound different. I got from another friend a cheap Chinese thing that is the size of a packet of 20 cigarettes, the Class D 50 watt per channel amplifier. I got two of them actually. I gave them to Alan, and we fitted one to somebody's TV, and then one day he was feeling bored. And when Alan feels bored, he builds an amplifier. So he put this amplifier into a box and he put a normal power supply on it, and it sounded okay. So he went to Mantech and bought a switch mode power supply, put it on there. He phoned me back, he phoned me up, he said, tell me, why have I been messing around with valves for 45 years? Because that funny little cheapy, when I say cheapy, I'm talking $5 cheapy. Amplifier sounds actually better than any other amplifier inside. And it is very like my tact. In other words, it's not there. You can't actually hear the amplifier at all. My triodes, I refer to them as my Warman Cudby amplifiers. Because they're Warman Cudby. They don't have very much grip on the bass. The mid-range is very nice and warm, and the treble is quite sweet. The Leek has a lot more grip on the bass. It is a little bit brighter in that it has not a harsher treble, but certainly more prominent treble. And I would be very hard pressed to say which one, if I had to get rid of one of them, which one I'd get rid of.
And of course, using the loudspeaker setup that you use, in general, it's high efficiency.
Yeah.
So absolute power is not what you're after.
No, and you know, it's actually quite ludicrous, those Onken cabins that Alan has with the 604 Altex in. Alan built, another useful thing. Alan built a headphone amplifier which puts out a whole 800 milliwatts, 0.8 watts. And it drives those Altex to the point where you think it's too loud in the room. You know, so you don't actually need power if you've got efficiency, which saves them all sorts of things, including the electricity bill. There's a friend who's got one of those enormous krills that you could actually weld with, I think.
Indeed. And briefly moving back to the end, then again, the loudspeaker end, do you have a favorite driver, or is there a holy grail that you are in search of?
Supposedly, holy grail, I tend to stick to Goodmans where I can, purely because I grew up with them. I've had them for I don't know, 50 odd years, 60 years I've had Goodman speakers. And I happen to like the sound of them. They were designed by a man called Ted Jordan, who I think was probably the only person in the last, I don't know, 50, 60 years who could actually design the driver from first principles. He left Goodman's and he started up E.F. Jordan Designs. Have you ever heard of a Jordan Watt module?
I've heard of the Jordan brand, but not of that particular one.
Okay, Jordan Watt was a thing about, I don't know, about 90 millimeters square, had a metal cone speaker in it, and you bought in a whole frame thing, and you could just put them down and play them. And yeah, they're small speakers. The speaker couldn't have been much more than about, I don't know, 2.5 inch, 3 inch driver. And the idea was that you bought half a dozen modules. You wanted a big system, you just added more modules.
Oh, yeah.
And Ted Jordan went off on this metal cone thing, which he carried on till the day he died. But anyway, Goodmans are wherever you look at my room, I've got Goodmans. This new speaker that I managed to get a pair of Goodman's Audium 51, which is a 12-inch speaker designed for guitar. In fact, a stupid little story. When the Beatles got going, the only people they could find to actually sponsor them in terms of equipment was the company that basically just started called Vox. And the speaker amplifier combo that they got had a Goodman's 51 Audium and a Goodman's mid-range horn. And they worked for like that for a couple of years, and they needed more power, and Vox switched to Celestion drivers and put two 12-inch drivers in the box, but they stuck with the mid-range horn. So I'm afraid I do tend to go for Goodmans where I can. But having said that, my A7 stack, the two A7s, the one set has got 15 or 16 inch Fostex drivers, and the other one, the lower cabinet, has got 15 inch Goodman's drivers, because guess what? That's what I had. And then the mid-range driver on the Artigo clones is Fostex. The tweeters are, as I said, two JBL 075s. In the new speaker, I've got the 15-inch Axiom, Audium, a 12-inch Audium, as per the Beatles. And I managed to find two pairs of Midax horns and drivers. I thought, well, that would be very nice. So I decided to put two per side. The trouble is when you start putting two mid-range units and two tweeters side by side, you start getting a form of comb filtering. you get they interfere with one another. And the answer to that is use an acoustic lens, because that sort of directs the sound. It also almost sprays it in the right direction. It cuts down the top and bottom lobes and the side lobes. For on my Altec clones, I've got Perspex lenses which I
Is that
drew
by
out
any
and
chance
played.
something to do with your WhatsApp icon?
Yes, it's quite possible, yeah. Oh, I
It
never look
sounded
at those
familiar.
things. But anyway, so yeah. But it's very much mix and match. I mean, this new cabinet has got Goodman's Audium drivers mixed with EV 12 inches. The two speakers sound totally dissimilar, but they blend. Everything blends, and if you can get the blend to work, it works.
Well, that leads me to my next question quite nicely. It's about compromise, because there's always an element of compromise when we're trying to set up something at home. And you've talked about your efforts with capacitors, and you're not convinced about some things. I know you've written about cables, and maybe you could enlighten us a bit about that, your views on that. But if you had to compromise, where would you compromise in, or where should one be looking to compromise in doing home audio?
The usual compromise that people have to make, assuming that cost is no object, is the size of the speakers. Because you mentioned earlier, there ain't no substitute for cubic inches, which is true until they really brought in turbocharging. But your cabinet volume is very much part of the sound. The speakers needed to actually develop a presence, a scale. My Altec A7, the first thing anybody says when they list it, oh, the scale of these things, because you don't have the damn things stand 2.4 meters high, and they're a good 800 millimeters wide, and you don't actually hear them because you've got this whole sound field in front of you. But that comes with cabinet volume and driver size when you're talking about the lower ranges. I'd like horns on the mid-range and the treble, because they give you an immediacy that you don't get out of cone speakers or the average sort of cone speaker. Mm-hmm. So yeah, compromise, speaker size. If I was forced to choose, if I had to go into an old age home and I could take some things with me, I would take my tact amplifier. I'd get rid of the triodes and the lead before I got rid of the tact. Because the tact is one thing that you don't have to worry about it coloring the sound. It's one thing out of the equation to make music.
I think in that answer, Chris, maybe you've surprised a few people. You certainly surprised me a bit. So one shouldn't make assumptions about people's decisions. I do have a question here now from Dave Francis, and you may have answered some of it, I think. Here goes anyway. Do you have any future projects or items you'd like to acquire?
No, but that's I never do. They just sort of come along. I mean, this latest thing, it just happened. This latest speaker that I bought, I had no plans whatever to build any more speakers. And then this friend of mine came along and decided he wanted that Goodman's thing that I had, those double horns. And as part of the deal, he had 2 pairs of Goodman's mid-axes and 1 pair of Audiums. So I thought, another one. So I thought, this is the chance to do another speaker. Yeah, these things happen, and then you sort of run with it. I also, now that I think of it, just thinking back a little bit, you were talking about Holy Grail, and I remember saying I've never really had a speaker that's smaller than 12 inches. That's actually not true. I did at one point, not so long ago, buy a pair of Goodman's Axiom 80s. The Axiom 80s are 10-inch drivers, but they are unique in that they have no suspension on the cones. The cones are actually free in the basket, and they're 3 little cantilevers that keep it center. There's no spider where it goes into the voice coil. There's 3 little cantilevers that hold it in position. And those drivers are rated with a frequency response of 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, one driver. I mean, it's unreal. And they also up around about 98 dB, and I put them into a coddle type horn cabinet and got persuaded to get rid of them to a friend of mine who had another pair that somebody put surrounds on, also in a coddle cabinet. He stacked them in his sitting room. And from that, I got an Altec A7 that we modified to make the cabinet not as wide, slimmer, but taller. So I ended up with that. So I actually have 3 speaker systems sitting in my room. And I don't have space for 3 side by side.
Well, I think again that story illustrates how if you stand on a street corner long enough, you're going to bump into somebody you know, and
Yeah.
you know that's looking ahead. But maybe just to look back a bit, you've had a long and interesting journey into audio, and I recall when we spoke earlier, you were telling me about an encounter, and maybe you could just share that encounter with our viewers about how you came to cross paths with Andre Hanekom.
Okay. I mentioned that I started a radiator manufacturing plant. And as part of the plant, we got the local agency for what amounts to a radiator, a tube that is flat with fins stuck on at the ends around, and they go into rubber grommets in the header plates. In other words, you can plug separate tubes in and out. So if a tube gets damaged, you can just plug it out and plug a new one in. And the rubber that was used for these grommets was a thing called Viton rubber. And we used to buy, I don't know, 5,000 of the things a month. So we had a very good supplier. Well, he phoned me up out of the blue one day and said, listen, would I please contact this man in Cape Town who's looking for some rubber? He's doing something with some hi-fi thing. He doesn't know what it is. But please won't I help him sort it out because he knows I'm interested in hi-fi. I phoned Andre, and what it was, he needed rubber for damping. And of course, butyl rubber is if you take a ball of butyl rubber and you drop it, it's going to flop onto the floor. It doesn't bounce at all. So I got him some samples and sent it down to him. From then on, we became home friends, really. We spoke to each other at least twice a month, and usually for an hour and a half at a time. And I never met Andre, much to my disappointment. But at one point, I gave him a Spectral Signature cartridge, and he gave me the 3rd example of his Mantis that was stamped 003. And absolutely lovely cartridge. It's easily the best moving coil cartridge I've ever owned. Years later, I returned it to him because the stylus had actually twisted in its holding, and I returned it for him to fix. And I never ever got it back because he kept saying to me, no, I want to give you a new one. And I'll make it, but he never got to it.
And there we are, he never will.
Yeah, I'm actually devastated when his wife died, and the way he ended up also was not a nice story.
Truly a sad story, and I guess music is littered with so many, but sometimes life is littered with many of those.
He was another one with leak amplifiers.
Oh, yes, I remember well. I just want to digress for a moment. A little birdie tells me that you've got an interest in speed and power. And can you tell us how your choice of car relates to your choice of hi-fi?
Yeah, well, you see, that goes back to the days before I was married. I used to ride motorbikes, and you know, like audio, you have motorbikes and you upgrade. And my last bike was an original K-Naught
Can I
750
just I'm
Honda.
going to interrupt there and say, I'm glad that you didn't say you have a wife and then you upgrade. Anyway, moving right along.
Now, I made one fundamental mistake when I got married. I took my wife for a ride on the bike. I should never have done that because I got a polite request. Don't you think it's time you'd rather got a car? Anyway, and yes, I was very interested in cars. I had a friend who was a very good motor mechanic. He was a very good Catholic because he had 12 children. And obviously his wife couldn't work. So he had to do private jobs to try and bring more money in because, I mean, literally, he had 12 children. And his hobby was Jeeps. And he had a V8 in it. And we sat and worked on it and modified it and what have you. And along the line, I bought a Jeep because I needed something to tow the horse box and da. Anyway, so cars have always been a little bit of a thing with me. Do you remember the South African Dart?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I had a Dart, which I built up also with a friend. He was the brains behind it, I was the brawn. With a modified Alpha motor and gearbox in it that was remarkably quick for its time. I mean, it was easily good for 160 miles an hour, whatever that is in kilometers these days. He had a Dart as well, but his had a V8 in it, and that was damn sight faster. But, you know, and this sort of bloomed and blossoms. And over the years, in all my repping days, I ended up driving stupid blooming cars or buckies. And when we started the radiator plant, the first year we drove buckies, then we upgraded to 318 BMWs, and then upgraded that to 330 BMWs. And I had 2 of those. And then when I started my own business, we needed a car to travel backwards and forwards. And because my son stays in Springs, we thought, well, we'll just buy one car. So we bought a C32 Merc, which was the rather quick AMG thing. But that thing was a little bit fragile and extremely thirsty. So we got rid of that and we bought a 335 BMW, which was very nice. Whatever. At any rate, when I retired, I had a bucky, and I said to my son, well, that's fine because we're not going anywhere really. One day he phoned me and he said, listen, just come out to the road. He wants to show me something. So I walked out onto the street and here he comes down the road in this blooming M5 with a V10. He pulls it in and says, oh, take it for a drive. So I drove it. I said to him, oh, you've got a really nice car here. He says, no. He says, you got it. I bought it for you. Look, it's from my business. But I mean, the point is he bought it for me. And it's not new. I mean, it's a 2006 model and it was very low mileage and very good condition. So yes, the trouble is I tend to drive too fast.
Look, my next question, Chris, is do you think your son would be open to adopting?
I don't think you'd like it. No, he's actually, he's a good kid. But, he's bloody 48. We must think kid.
Okay, then what I'm going to do is wrap up and with the last couple of questions, and maybe that's an interesting one. Has he followed in your footsteps when it comes to audio?
No. I built him up a system using Goodman's Triaxiom speakers, and he was very happy to listen to his heavy metal rubbish on it. And then he developed a pair of children, and it all got packed away in the box, and the Triaxiom speakers actually went down to Andre Hanekom. And I've tried to get him to put other speakers in, but it doesn't seem to be anywhere on his list of things to do.
Okay. Well, then finally, before we wrap up this evening, A question that's been on my mind for a while, and I've asked it in various ways of various people, but where do you think we as enthusiasts go wrong when it comes to hi-fi?
You're going to get me on a bandwagon, you realize this. I'm very biased to begin with, okay? I listen to classical music. I listen to a lot of organ. I try to replicate live sound as much as I can. Or when I say live sound, I'm talking about the sound of an orchestra.
You go to concerts a lot?
Not anymore because, staying where I stay, I cannot leave my house alone at night because when I come back, the house will probably be gone, never mind the contents of it. But yeah, I was actually, the last concert I went to was literally 4 years ago with Alan. We went to listen to some woman blowing an oboe.
I like the way you put it. But anyway, you were telling us about where we go wrong.
Yeah, sorry, I do tend to drift. I don't know how many people actually know what live accurate sound is. How many people go to concerts? How many have the opportunity to go to a concert talking about classical music? That's number one. If you go to a band session or rock bands, you're hearing amplified music. So what is your reference then? And if you have somebody that plays jazz, can you come home and listen to a recording of that and say, yeah, it sounds the same? I don't know that we're critical enough about it, and I think we put far too much emphasis on the equipment and not enough on the actual music. Some years ago, I schlepped all the way down to Kimberley with a tape recorder in a bucky to go and do a recording at Kimberley Cathedral. And Sue Cock brought down half of the National, or whatever they call them, choir. And I recorded it, and I came home and I listened to the recording. I thought to myself, they were very happy with it. I wasn't, because I couldn't capture the sound of that whole ensemble. And very, very few people can. I had to go just now early on at Professor Keith Johnson and his reference recordings. Okay, I have another little anecdote. I have an organ builder friend called David Smith. When he comes to visit, I play spot the organ with him. I'll put on an organ recording, and he's got to identify it. And he's very, very good at it. I put on a Dorian recording of the organ in the Meyerson Center in the States, which has a Fisk organ, and he identified it like a flash. I put on a reference recording by Keith Johnson of the same organ in obviously the same auditorium. And he said to me, no, he has no idea. I said, it's the Fisk. He says, no, it's not. He says, I know that Fisk. I did my apprenticeship with Fisk. I've worked on that organ, and that recording is not that organ. I showed him the thing, and he said, he doesn't know what the hell Johnson did with recording. So, in other words, a lot of the stuff we get, recordings we get, are so changed from the original, from what they should be, to suit the mastering engineer or what have you. So, yeah.
I think wise words there, Chris, and a suitable note, if you'll pardon the pun, to end on. We spend far too much effort on the equipment and not enough on the music it's playing. Chris Templer, it's been an honor, and I think let's call it a night from me. But if there are any other questions from the floor, I hope you'll give us a little more time if people are having a chance.
No problem. Can I make one last corny crack?
You can make as many as you like.
Okay, Alan Parsons, recorded outside of me, what have you. His comment was, what he doesn't like about audiophiles is they use his music to listen to their equipment.
So true. So true.
As long as they're buying recordings. Any other questions from folks?
I think that's all right. Then, Chris, and thanks very much to our guest, and thanks very much to all of you who signed in this evening, checked in, load shedding permitting. Thanks for joining us, and we hope to see you again in the near future. And by the way, like all of our other recordings, this will be available on YouTube in due course.
Thank you.
Thank you very much as well. Thank you from my side. Okay. Bye-bye.
Good night.
Good night.